The UFC might be the premier mixed martial arts promotion in the game, but if you think that they're the perfect company, think again. For today's video, we're going to look into 10 changes the promotion made that really managed to anger the fans. Changes that, as it turned out, weren't made for the better. The Reebok Deal. Fighter pay is always going to be a point of contention between the UFC and its fans. The Reebok Deal was a controversial sponsorship agreement that was implemented by the UFC in 2015, replacing the previous system in which fighters could have multiple sponsorships on their fight gear. Under the Reebok Deal, fighters were required to wear exclusively Reebok apparel during fight week and were compensated based on their tenure with the UFC. While the deal was intended to create a more professional look for the sport and provide a consistent source of income for fighters, it was widely criticized for its flaws. Fighters often reported much lower sponsorship payouts than they received previously, and many complained about the limited selection and quality of Reebok gear. Additionally, the removal of personalized sponsorships hit lower-tier fighters particularly hard, who relied on those sponsorships for crucial income. The deal was met with strong backlash from fans and fighters alike and eventually led to its termination in 2021. While the Reebok deal may have had good intentions, no amount of Dana White BS can convince us that it was the best move. USADA drug testing. Since 2015, the United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA, has been the official anti-doping agency for the UFC. USADA is an independent organization tasked with conducting random drug testing and enforcing anti-doping policies in the UFC. But to say that the UFC's partnership with USADA has been divisive would be putting it lightly, with some fighters criticizing the organization for its strict policies and procedures. Under USADA's testing program, fighters can be subject to random testing at any time, including out-of-competition testing, which can disrupt their training schedules. Despite the controversy, USADA has been credited with improving the overall integrity of the sport and making it safer for fighters. In recent years, USADA has implemented enhanced testing methods, including the use of blood passports and the detection of previously undetectable substances. But if you think they're catching even a small portion of the fighters who are clearly doping, we may have some bad news for you. Like all anti-doping programs, it's a flawed system. But it's the one we have right now. Weight cutting. Look, weight cutting has always been an issue, but the more the sport evolves and knowledge of technology and nutrition improves, we're really starting to see it spiral out of control. And the fact that the UFC hasn't properly addressed it? Yeah, it's not good. While it's essential for fighters to compete in their respective weight classes and be competitive with the other fighters cutting weight cutting can be dangerous and even life-threatening. Several fighters have suffered severe health consequences over the years due to extreme weight-cutting practices. To combat this issue, various organizations, including the UFC, have implemented new rules and regulations to ensure fighters' safety during the weight-cutting process. But if you ask us, they haven't even come close to making things safer and more evenly balanced for their fighters. It does seem as though something terrible will have to happen for things to really change. Fighter pay. The UFC is one of the world's leading sporting promotions, but even today it doesn't seem as though the fighters are getting their fair share of the intake. The UFC pays its fighters a base salary, with additional bonuses for winning fights, performance of the night, and fight of the night. However, many fighters feel that the base pay is not enough, especially considering the high costs of training, medical expenses, and other associated costs of being a professional fighter. The issue of fighter pay has become even more contentious as the UFC has become a multi-billion-dollar company, with some calling for a higher percentage of revenue to be shared with the athletes who put their bodies on the line in the Octagon. While the UFC has made some changes to its pay structure in recent years, the issue of fighter pay remains a major point of contention between the organization and its fighters. As we've already discussed, these athletes can't even put their own sponsorship on their shorts, meaning that they're in an undeniably tough spot if they want to compete at the highest level. 12-6 elbow ban. The banning of 12-6 elbow strike is one of the most controversial rulemaking decisions in MMA. The move itself involves a downward elbow strike where the fighter's arm moves in a straight line from a 12 o'clock position to a 6 o'clock position. The strike was banned by the Unified Rules of MMA in 2000 due to concerns over its potential to cause serious injury. The ban has been a point of contention for many fighters and fans who argue that the technique is not inherently dangerous and should be allowed. However, the ban remains in place in most MMA organizations, including the UFC. Fighters such as John Jones were made to suffer this rule's existence, and his only loss in the sport comes as a direct result of it. Most fans argue that this is a cosmetic issue and not one that comes down to any real thought. If you can flying knee someone in the face, why not allow these elbow strikes? Overall, the 12-6 elbow ban remains a controversial topic in MMA, with opinions divided on whether the technique should be allowed or not. Women's Featherweight. Look, the UFC has come a very long way since Dana White boldly declared that women would never fight in his promotion. In fact, some of the biggest stars we've ever seen have come from the female divisions. But are we really going to sit here and pretend that 145 pounds is a real weight class? They made the division specifically so they could give Chris Cyborg fights. And now, years later, after Amanda Nunes knocked her out to become a double champion, the division still exists. And to this day, it still doesn't have rankings or even enough fighters to fill out a top 15. And to think that there was once talk of cutting the flyweight division. A strange decision by the UFC indeed. Mainstream popularity. There are some major divides between the old fans of MMA and the new, with a lot of so-called casual fans being blamed for ruining the sport. Sure, the UFC were always going to lean into whatever made them popular, but these days, some of their moves have been a little strange, to say the least. In the early days, it was often considered a barbaric and violent sport that was only watched by a select few. However, with the rise of organizations such as the UFC and the growth of social media, MMA has become more widely recognized and accepted. The UFC's success in particular has played a significant role in increasing the sport's mainstream appeal. The organization has invested heavily in promoting its athletes and events, and its partnership with ESPN has helped bring MMA to a wider audience. The popularity of MMA has also been boosted by the success of fighters who have crossed over into mainstream entertainment, such as Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor. MMA isn't the niche entertainment vehicle it once was, and there's a sizable portion of the fans who believe that Dana and his team sold their souls in the process. Interim titles. Interim titles were originally introduced in the UFC when the reigning champion is unable to compete for an extended period of time due to injury or other reasons. This allows the UFC to keep the division active and the fans engaged while the reigning champion is sidelined. While interim titles serve a purpose in keeping the division active, they also have been the subject of controversy in the UFC. In recent times, they're often used whenever there's a need to make a pay-per-view card a bit more sellable to the masses. The champ might have fought 3 weeks ago, but if Dana sees fit, a secondary interim belt could be created just to drive up event buys. Some fans and fighters argue that they devalue the significance of the actual championship belt and create confusion in the division. In addition, there have been instances where an interim champion has been stripped of their title upon the return of the reigning champion, leading to questions about the legitimacy of the interim title in the first place. Overall, it's an undeniably annoying thing to witness for purists within the fan base, because, let's be real, it wasn't always like this. The ESPN deal. On the surface, the deal inked by the UFC to align their business with ESPN might seem like a win-win for the fans and the fighters. But when you're contracted to put on several events per month, all of a sudden, you're going to really need to fill out your roster. All of a sudden, fight night events featuring a headliner between the number 13 and number 14 ranked light heavyweights in the world begin popping up. This watering down of the product makes each UFC event lose its special feeling in some ways, and while, sure, The promotions still put major effort into their biggest pay-per-views. When you have 3 or even 4 events coming at you every month, it's a little harder to be a fan of the sport. Ticket prices. Ticket prices for UFC events have been rising steadily over the years, much to the chagrin of many fans. While UFC events used to be relatively affordable, they are now among the most expensive sporting events to attend. The reasons for this are complex, but there are several factors at play. One major factor is the growing popularity of the sport, which has led to increased demand for tickets. Additionally, the UFC has expanded into new markets, including international markets, which has driven up the price of tickets in those areas. Another factor is the rising cost of hosting events, which include everything from venue rental fees to fighter salaries. To offset these costs, the UFC has raised ticket prices. While many fans are unhappy with the rising costs of attending UFC events, the organization argues that the prices are necessary to maintain the high quality of the events and to pay the fighters fairly. But as we already pointed out, the events are suffering and the fighters really aren't getting paid what they deserve. Makes you think, right? But what's your own least favorite change that you've seen in the sport of MMA and the UFC in recent years? Do let us know in the comments section below.